The prairie stretched out in every direction, a sea of golden grass, swaying beneath the pale blue of a late autumn sky. The land was wide and empty, touched only by the wind that whistled across it and the occasional cry of a hawk circling high above. At the heart of that endless quiet lay the Turner Ranch, acres of grazing land bordered by weathered fencing, a few clusters of cottonwood trees near the creek, and a sturdy but unadorned ranch house that faced into the wind like a sentinel refusing to bow. Inside that house lived Caleb Turner, a man who had grown so accustomed to silence that he barely noticed it anymore. In his mid-30s, tall and broad-shouldered from years of hard labor, he carried himself with the steady patience of a man who knew the land better than he knew people. His days followed the same rhythm: rise before dawn, stoke the fire, see to the cattle, mend what needed mending, and end the day with nothing but the company of his thoughts and the lowing of his herd in the distance. Caleb had not always been alone. As he saddled his horse that morning to ride the pasture, memories lingered of a time when laughter had filled the ranch house. His parents had built this place from nothing, carving out a life with grit and determination. His mother's gentle humming while she baked bread, his father's booming laugh when a stubborn calf broke loose. Those sounds had once made the house feel alive, but his father had died suddenly. A fever that burned too hot for too long, and his mother followed not 2 winters later, her body worn thin by grief. Caleb, barely a man at the time, was left with the ranch, the cattle, and a silence that grew heavier with each passing year. The town lay a good half-day's ride south. He rarely went there, save for supplies or the occasional cattle sale. Folks knew him, respected him even, but they kept their distance. He had never been much of a talker, and after years of keeping to himself, people had grown used to calling him a solitary sort. Sometimes he caught the whispers, the lonely Turner boy, the man who talks more to his cows than to people. But he didn't mind. The land was enough. Or at least, that's what he told himself. That day had been like any other. The sun had rolled slow across the sky, the air crisp with the promise of winter. Caleb spent the morning checking the fences along the north pasture, the steady creak of leather and the sound of his horse's hooves breaking the monotony of silence. By afternoon he was splitting wood near the barn, his axe thudding rhythmically into the logs. Sweat glistened on his brow, despite the chill in the air, and he paused only long enough to wipe his forehead with the back of his hand before carrying another armload of wood into the shed. As evening settled in, the sky turned a soft wash of purples and oranges, the horizon glowing as the sun sank low. Caleb finished his chores, leading the last of the cattle into the corral, and returned to the house. He lit the oil lamp on the kitchen table, the flickering flame pushing back the shadows, and prepared a simple meal of beans and cornbread. Eating alone was second nature, but that night he felt the weight of the silence, pressing heavier than usual. He lingered by the fire longer than necessary, staring into the flames as if they might answer the thoughts he wouldn't give voice to. The ranch had been built for a family, for the laughter of children running across the yard, for a woman's voice calling them in for supper. But those sounds had never come. Caleb had long since stopped imagining them, or at least he tried. It was late when the first sound reached him. A faint noise carried on the wind, almost swallowed by the crackle of the fire. He frowned, tilting his head. The cry came again, soft, muffled, and strange. Not the bellow of a cow, nor the yip of a coyote. Something else. He rose from his chair, grabbing his lantern from the hook by the door. The night air was sharp as he stepped outside, the stars glittering coldly overhead. The sound came again, faint but distinct now, drifting from the direction of the barn. Caleb narrowed his eyes. His cattle were bedded down for the night, and no animal should be inside the barn at this hour. His hand instinctively brushed the handle of the rifle leaning by the door, but after a moment's pause, he left it behind. He didn't sense danger, only mystery. The crunch of his boots against frosted ground was the only sound as he crossed the yard. The lantern's glow cut a narrow path through the dark, casting long shadows on the barn's wooden walls. He pushed the heavy door open, its hinges groaning in protest, and lifted the lantern high. At first glance, the barn looked as it always did. Stacks of hay bales, tools hanging on the walls, the smell of earth and straw. But then he saw movement near the far corner, a shape huddled in the shadows. His breath caught as the lantern light revealed her. A woman sat on the hay, her face pale and drawn, her hair damp with sweat. In her arms, she clutched two tiny bundles wrapped in torn blankets. The faint cries he had heard now filled the air, the soft, urgent wails of newborn babies. Caleb froze, every thought scattering. The woman's eyes lifted to his, wide with fear and exhaustion. "Please," she whispered, her voice raw and trembling. "Don't send us away. I didn't know where else to go." For a long moment, Caleb stood in stunned silence. This was not what he had expected, not by a long shot. He had imagined a stray calf, maybe even a thief desperate for shelter. But this fragile woman and the two helpless infants pressed against her chest, this was something his lonely world had never prepared him for. She tried to shift, wincing in pain as she adjusted the babies in her arms. Her clothes were worn and travel-stained, the hem of her dress torn, her boots caked with mud. The babies whimpered softly, their tiny fists peeking from the folds of the blankets. Caleb's first instinct was hesitation. He didn't know her, didn't know what trouble might have brought her here. But the sight of the children silenced every question. They were so small, so utterly defenseless. The thought of turning them away was unthinkable. "You shouldn't be out in this cold," he said finally, his voice low but steady. He stepped closer, the lantern's glow illuminating her face more fully. She was young, perhaps mid-20s, her features delicate, despite the exhaustion etched into them. Her lips trembled as she nodded. "I had nowhere else," she whispered. "Please, just a place to rest, just for tonight." Caleb hesitated no longer. He extended a hand to her, his expression firm but gentle. "Come on, the house is warmer. You and the little ones need food and rest." Her eyes filled with tears as relief washed over her. With trembling effort, she shifted the babies into one arm and reached for his hand. Caleb helped her to her feet, steadying her as she swayed with fatigue. The weight of her desperation pressed on him, awakening something he hadn't felt in years, a fierce, protective resolve. Together, they stepped out into the cold night. Caleb kept his lantern high, guiding her carefully across the yard. The house loomed ahead, its windows glowing softly with lamplight, no longer just a place of silence, but now a sanctuary. As he opened the door and ushered her inside, the warmth of the fire wrapped around them. The babies stirred and whimpered, their cries echoing softly in the once lonely room. Caleb closed the door behind them, sealing out the night. For the first time in years, the ranch was no longer silent, and deep inside, Caleb Turner felt the first stirrings of a change he could not yet name. The fire snapped and hissed in the hearth as Caleb eased Emily into the wooden chair closest to its warmth. She sank into it as though her body could no longer carry its own weight, the two small bundles cradled tightly in her arms. Her cheeks were pale beneath the flickering glow, but the children stirred with life, their faint whimpers puncturing the silence of the cabin. Caleb stood for a long moment, lantern still in his grip, uncertain of what to do. He was no stranger to hard work, to cattle birthing in the middle of the night, to wounds that needed stitching or storms that threatened his herd. But a woman and two tiny infants in his home? That was a kind of challenge he had never known. "Sit," Emily murmured softly, her voice rough from exhaustion. "I don't want to trouble you." "You're no trouble," Caleb replied quickly, more gruffly than he intended. He set the lantern on the table and crouched near the fire, adding a log to strengthen the flames. The warmth spread through the room, wrapping around them like a blanket. The babies stirred again, one letting out a high, thin cry that pierced through Caleb's chest. He straightened, watching as Emily rocked the child gently, murmuring soothing sounds. Her hands, though trembling with fatigue, moved with practiced care, cradling life as though it was both fragile and unbreakable. Caleb cleared his throat. "You'll need food." "I don't have much, but there's stew left from earlier. Bread, too." She looked up at him, eyes heavy with both gratitude and wariness. "Thank you." He moved to the kitchen space, ladling stew into a bowl and set it before her. He tore a piece of bread from the loaf and placed it at her side. Emily shifted one of the babies into the crook of her arm, freeing a hand to eat. She took a bite as though she hadn't tasted food in days, chewing slowly, savoring. Caleb lingered nearby, unsure whether to sit or to give her space. Finally, she looked at him again. "I know this must be strange for you, finding us in your barn, I mean." "That's one way of putting it," he admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. "Not every night you walk in and find strangers waiting in the hay, especially not babies." His gaze flickered to the bundles in her arms, curiosity and something deeper stirring inside him. Emily's lips curved into the faintest, tired smile. "They're barely a week old, Sarah and Samuel. I couldn't keep them out there any longer." "Out there?" Caleb asked gently. She looked down, adjusting the blankets around the infants. For a moment, she didn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, the words heavy. "My husband died in the spring. Fever. I had no family left, nowhere to go. Folks in town, they had opinions. Too many of them. I thought maybe I could manage alone, but—" She broke off, shaking her head. "When the babies came early, I couldn't do it anymore. I needed shelter, a place, anything." Caleb said nothing at first. The pain in her words was familiar, like an echo of his own past. He remembered watching his father's chest rise and fall until it didn't anymore. Remembered his mother fading slowly with grief. He knew the weight of carrying on alone, though he had never faced it with two tiny lives depending on him. "You've found this place," he said simply, his voice low but steady. "That's enough for now." She blinked quickly as though fighting tears. "I didn't mean to impose." "You're not imposing," Caleb interrupted, surprising himself with the firmness of his tone. "This house is too quiet anyway. You and the little ones. You're welcome here." Silence settled between them, softer now, no longer heavy with uncertainty, but with the quiet beginning of understanding. Emily returned her focus to the babies, one of whom stirred again, wriggling restlessly. She shifted him carefully, pressing her cheek to his downy hair. Caleb watched, something in his chest tightening. The sight of her rocking the infants stirred feelings he hadn't known were still inside him. Longing, tenderness, the ache of something missing. He pulled in a slow breath, forcing himself back to the present. "You'll need rest," he said. "There's a room down the hall. Not much, but the bed's clean. You and the babies can sleep there tonight." Emily hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you." Her voice broke a little on the words. He fetched blankets from the cupboard and carried them into the spare room, lighting the lamp on the bedside table. The room had been unused for years, but the bed was sturdy, the sheets neatly folded. As he arranged the blankets, he caught himself thinking of how empty it had been all this time and how different it would feel now. When he returned to the main room, Emily had risen from the chair, swaying slightly with fatigue. Caleb stepped forward quickly. "Let me." He reached out, steadying her with one hand while carefully supporting the baby she held in the other. Emily glanced up at him, startled, then slowly allowed him to guide her down the hallway. In the room, she settled onto the bed, placing the babies gently beside her. Caleb stood awkwardly near the door, unsure if he should stay or leave. "Good night, Mr. Turner," she whispered. "Caleb," he corrected softly. "Just Caleb." Her lips curved faintly again. "Good night, Caleb." He nodded once, then stepped out, pulling the door almost closed behind him. He lingered in the hallway for a long moment, listening to the faint sounds of her shifting, the baby's soft whimpers, and the quiet hush of her voice soothing them. When he finally returned to the main room, the silence felt different, no longer empty but alive with the presence of others. Caleb sat by the fire long after, staring into the flames. His house was no longer just his, and he realized he didn't mind. Not at all. The next morning broke cold and gray. Caleb rose early, as always, though the memory of the night lingered heavy in his mind. As he pulled on his boots, he paused, hearing the faintest cry through the wall. For the first time in years, the dawn brought more than chores. It brought the sound of life. He stepped into the kitchen and set water to boil, the familiar rhythm grounding him. A moment later, Emily appeared in the doorway, her hair loosely tied back, her dress wrinkled, but her eyes clearer after rest. She held one of the babies against her shoulder, rocking gently. "Morning," Caleb greeted, awkward but earnest. "Good morning," she answered, her voice soft but steadier than the night before. "I hope we didn't disturb you." "Not at all," Caleb said, though in truth he had woken several times in the night to the faint cries. But it hadn't disturbed him. If anything, it had eased the silence that usually pressed so heavily in the dark hours. He poured coffee into 2 cups and slid one toward her. She accepted it with a grateful nod, balancing the baby in one arm as she took a sip. Caleb's eyes lingered on her for a moment, the way she cradled the child, the tired but resolute strength in her posture. "Sarah and Samuel," he said, testing the names she had given. Emily smiled faintly. "Yes, Sarah's the quieter one. Samuel, he's louder, stronger lungs." As if on cue, the infant in her arms squirmed and let out a tiny wail. Emily chuckled softly, bouncing him gently. Caleb found himself smiling too, though he quickly hid it behind his coffee cup. The day unfolded differently than any Caleb could remember. Emily insisted on helping, though he tried to argue. She gathered eggs from the coop, humming softly to calm the babies tucked in a makeshift cradle near the doorway. She swept the floor, cooked a simple meal, her movements steady despite the weight of her new responsibilities. Caleb watched quietly, uncertain of how to place himself in this new rhythm. He had always done everything alone, yet now there was someone else filling the spaces of his home, bringing a kind of warmth he hadn't realized he missed. That evening, after chores were done, Caleb returned to the house to find Emily by the fire, rocking Sarah while Samuel slept in the cradle. Her voice carried softly, a lullaby that made Caleb pause in the doorway. The sound was gentle, soothing, filling the house in a way that made his chest ache. Emily glanced up, her cheeks coloring faintly as she caught him listening. "I'm sorry. Old habit." "Don't apologize," Caleb said quietly. "It's nice." The moment lingered between them, fragile but real. Caleb stepped further into the room, his eyes on the fire, but his thoughts on the woman and children who had turned his silent world into something he barely recognized. That night, as he lay in his bed, he listened to the faint sounds of the babies through the wall, their cries, Emily's soft voice soothing them. And for the first time in years, Caleb Turner did not feel alone. The prairie wind whistled through the gaps in the barn walls, carrying with it the faint scent of sagebrush and the first sharp hints of winter. Caleb leaned against the stall, wiping sweat from his brow as he watched Emily gather the last of the eggs from the nesting boxes. She moved carefully, one baby tied against her chest in a sling she had fashioned from an old flour sack, the other resting in a cradle by the door, bundled snug against the chill. "You don't have to do that," Caleb said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Chickens won't starve if I'm the one collecting." Emily glanced over her shoulder, her lips curving into a small smile. "And leave you to all the chores?" "Not likely. I can manage eggs, Caleb." He shook his head, but he couldn't help the warmth that spread through his chest as he watched her. She had only been at the ranch a short while, yet already she moved through it as though she belonged, her presence filling the silence with a rhythm that felt startlingly natural. The babies had grown stronger, their cries louder, their small faces rounder with each passing day. Caleb had found himself adjusting in ways he never thought possible. Rising at night when the wails grew sharp, stumbling to light the fire so Emily could warm milk, even learning to hold Samuel against his broad chest until the boy settled with hiccuping sighs. He was awkward, always afraid of his own rough hands, but the babies never seemed to mind. In the evenings when the day's work was done, they would gather by the fire. Emily would hum lullabies, the soft notes carrying through the cabin, while Caleb mended tack or carved small wooden shapes to keep his hands busy. The silence that had once pressed on him like a weight now felt different, alive, full, shared. But beyond the ranch, the world still turned and tongues still wagged. The first time Caleb noticed the shift was during a trip into town. He had loaded the wagon with hides and a few crates of butter to sell, and Emily had insisted on coming along. "The babies should get fresh air," she said, wrapping them in blankets before climbing onto the seat beside him. Caleb had hesitated, wary of what folks might say, but the hopeful look in her eyes left him unable to refuse. The road into town was long and dusty, the prairie stretching endlessly around them. Emily held Sarah close, her hair pulled back beneath the bonnet, her cheeks touched pink by the cold wind. Caleb found his eyes drawn to her more often than he intended, and each time he forced himself to look back to the horizon, his grip tightening on the reins. When they reached town, the wooden storefronts and dirt street bustled with the usual activity. Horses tied along the hitching posts snorted and stamped. Wagons rattled by, and the air buzzed with chatter. Caleb helped Emily down from the wagon, lifting her gently before gathering the babies. As they walked toward the general store, he felt eyes following them. Mrs. Hargrove, the butcher's wife, paused mid-conversation to glance their way. A group of men near the saloon leaned against the posts, their voices dropping as Caleb passed. By the time they entered the store, Caleb could feel the weight of whispers trailing them like a shadow. Emily noticed too. She kept her chin high, but her grip on Sarah tightened, and her steps grew quicker. Inside, the store smelled of flour, coffee, and oiled wood. Mr. Weller greeted them politely enough, though his eyes flicked between Caleb and Emily with thinly veiled curiosity. Emily busied herself with choosing cloth and sugar, avoiding conversation, while Caleb collected nails and lamp oil. When they returned to the counter, Weller cleared his throat. "Quite the family you've got there, Turner," he remarked, his tone edging on sly. Caleb's jaw tightened. "They're my guests," he said evenly. Weller raised his brows but said nothing more, only rang up the items with a knowing look. On the way out, Emily kept her eyes on the ground, her cheeks flushed. Caleb placed a steadying hand on her back, guiding her toward the wagon. He said nothing, but inside him, something twisted, an anger he hadn't felt in years. That anger deepened days later when Jed Carter rode up to the ranch. Jed was everything Caleb disliked in a man. Loud, brash, with a smile that never reached his eyes. He was a neighboring rancher with too much land and too little sense, always sniffing after opportunities to expand his reach. He swung down from his horse, dust clouding around his boots, and greeted Caleb with false cheer. "Turner?" he called, striding toward the corral. "Heard some interesting news in town. Seems you've taken in a lady and her little ones." Caleb met him at the fence, his expression hard. "What I do here is no concern of yours." Jed leaned against the rail, smirking. "Oh, I think it is. Folks are talking. A widow showing up on your doorstep. Babies in tow and you playing house? Doesn't look good, Turner. Not good at all." Caleb's hands clenched at his sides. "Watch your words." But Jed only chuckled, tipping his hat. "Don't get sore. Just thought I'd warn you. People don't take kindly to scandal, especially when children are involved. Wouldn't want your reputation or your business to suffer." With that, he swung back into his saddle and rode off, leaving dust and bitterness in his wake. That evening, Emily found Caleb chopping wood with more force than necessary, the axe biting deep into the logs. She set Sarah in the cradle by the porch and stepped closer. "Something happened," she said quietly. Caleb paused, breathing hard, sweat glistening on his brow. He looked at her, his eyes still smoldering with anger. "Jed Carter came by. Said things he had no right saying." Emily's shoulders slumped. "About me?" Caleb hesitated, then nodded. She turned away, her arms wrapping around herself. "I knew this would happen. I shouldn't have come here. I've brought trouble to your door." "You've brought no trouble," Caleb said firmly, dropping the axe and striding toward her. "Jed's a fool who likes the sound of his own voice. Let him talk. Let all of them talk. None of it matters." Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. It matters to me. I don't want to ruin your good name. People will think. Let them think what they want. Caleb cut in, his voice gentler now. I don't care what stories they tell in town. I know the truth. That's enough. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the evening wind tugging at Emily's hair, the cries of the babies drifting softly from the porch. Then, slowly, she nodded, but the doubt in her eyes remained, shadowed and heavy. That night, Caleb lay awake listening to the sounds of the babies through the wall. He thought of Jed's words, of the whispers in town, of Emily's tears. He had lived alone so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to have something, someone, to protect. But now, with Emily and the children under his roof, the idea of losing them, of watching them driven away by gossip and cruelty, filled him with a determination that burned hotter than any fire. He would not let them be taken from him. Not by Jed Carter, not by the town, not by anyone. Outside, the prairie wind howled against the windows, carrying the voices of rumor and judgment. But inside the ranch house, Caleb Turner lay in the dark, his heart no longer silent but fierce with resolve. The first flakes of snow drifted down on a bitter wind, spiraling across the prairie like white feathers scattered by unseen hands. Caleb pulled his coat tighter as he secured the last of the cattle in the corral. The sky above had turned a hard gray, heavy and low, promising more than just a light dusting. Winter was arriving early and fast, with the kind of storm that could swallow the land whole. He cast a glance toward the house. Smoke curled from the chimney, thin against the darkening sky. He could almost see Emily at the window, her face pale in the lamplight, the babies bundled close. The image steadied him, even as unease pressed in from all sides. By the time he stomped the snow from his boots on the porch, the wind was howling. Inside, the warmth of the fire wrapped around him, but it couldn't chase away the knot forming in his chest. Emily sat near the hearth, cradling Sarah in her arms while Samuel dozed in the cradle. Her eyes lifted at his entrance, filled with the kind of worry that needed no words. "It's coming in fast," Caleb said, shrugging off his coat. "Best we settle in. This storm might last days." Emily nodded, but her gaze flickered to the cradle. "They've both been restless today," she murmured, "fussing more than usual. I thought it was just the change in weather." Caleb crossed the room, crouching near the cradle. Samuel stirred, letting out a soft whimper, his tiny face flushed. Caleb frowned, brushing a gentle hand across the child's brow. Heat radiated beneath his touch. "He's warm," Caleb said quietly. "Too warm." Emily's arms tightened around Sarah, who whimpered as though in answer. Her voice broke. "So is she." The room seemed to close in around them. The crackle of the fire, the howl of the wind outside, the faint cries of the babies, all of it pressed against Caleb's chest, suffocating. He looked at Emily, at the fear widening her eyes, and felt a surge of helplessness he had never known. "They need a doctor," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Caleb's jaw tightened. The town was miles away, the storm already raging. Riding out in weather like this was near suicide, but the sight of those tiny faces, fever burning through their fragile bodies, left no choice. "I'll go," he said, the words steady despite the dread curling in his gut. Emily's head snapped up. "You can't. It's too dangerous. You'll freeze before you reach town." "If I stay, they'll suffer," Caleb countered. "Dr. Harrison's the only chance." Tears shimmered in her eyes. "I can't lose them. I can't." Caleb took her free hand, his grip firm and sure. "You won't. I'll bring the doctor. I swear it." For a moment, she only stared at him, her face pale and stricken. Then, slowly, she nodded, her hand trembling in his. Caleb wasted no time. He pulled on his heaviest coat, wrapped a scarf tight around his neck, and grabbed the lantern. Outside, the storm had already thickened, snow driving sideways in the wind. He saddled his horse with numb fingers, every motion sharpened by urgency. As he swung into the saddle, he looked back toward the house. Emily stood at the window, a shadow in the glow of lamplight, the babies pressed close. For an instant, the sight burned into him. A promise, a reason. Then he lowered his head against the wind and spurred the horse forward. The prairie vanished beneath the storm. Snow lashed at his face, stung his eyes, clung to his beard in frozen crystals. The wind roared so loud he could hardly hear the hoofbeats, could hardly think. He bent low over the horse's neck, guiding the animal by instinct more than sight. The world narrowed to the circle of light from his lantern and the relentless drive of the storm. Minutes stretched into hours. Caleb's fingers stiffened on the reins, his legs numb in the stirrups. More than once, he nearly veered off the path, the prairie's landmarks erased beneath the endless white. But each time his resolve faltered, he thought of Emily's tearful eyes, of Sarah's flushed face, of Samuel's weak cries. They pulled him forward, stronger than any fear. At last, the faint glow of town lights pierced the blizzard. Caleb urged his horse onward, half frozen but unyielding, until the familiar outlines of buildings loomed through the snow. He rode straight to the doctor's house, swinging down from the saddle with a stumble. His fist pounded on the door, the sound lost in the storm, until the door opened to reveal Dr. Harrison, lantern in hand, his expression startled. "Turner? What in God's name?" "Babies," Caleb gasped, his breath ragged. "Fever! They need you! Now!" Harrison didn't hesitate. He snatched up his bag, pulled on his coat, and followed Caleb back into the storm. Together they mounted and rode hard, the doctor grim but determined. The return felt longer, every second clawing at Caleb's chest. By the time the ranch came into view, lanterns glowing faintly through the snow, he was half frozen, his horse lathered with sweat. Emily flung the door open as they dismounted, her face streaked with tears relief, and fear mingling in her eyes. Inside, the warmth of the fire did little to chase the cold from Caleb's bones, but he didn't care. He hovered near the cradle as Harrison examined the babies, his hands steady, his face unreadable. Emily clutched Caleb's arm, her body trembling. At last, the doctor looked up. "They're burning, but we caught it in time. I'll mix a draft to ease their fever. They'll need rest, warmth, and care, but they'll pull through." Emily broke into sobs, burying her face against Caleb's shoulder. He held her tightly, his own chest heaving with relief, the tension of the ride draining from him all at once. As the doctor worked, Caleb looked down at the twins, their tiny faces still flushed, but their breathing steadier. His heart swelled with something fierce, something unshakable. He had risked everything to bring help, and he would do it again without hesitation. For the first time, he understood the depth of what had taken root inside him. This woman, these children, they were no longer strangers beneath his roof. They were the reason his heart beat, the reason he fought the storm, the reason he lived. And as the blizzard raged outside, Caleb Turner knew with absolute certainty that he would never let them go. The blizzard still howled outside, rattling the windows and piling snow against the door, but inside the little ranch house, the fire burned strong, throwing warmth and light into the shadows. The babies lay bundled in the cradle, tiny faces damp with sweat, but their breathing softer, steadier. Dr. Harrison bent over them, murmuring as he spooned a thin draught between their lips, his hands practiced and sure. Emily sat close, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. Her eyes never left her children, tears streaking her cheeks, lips moving in whispered prayers. Caleb stood behind her, one hand resting on her shoulder, steady and grounding. He felt the tremor of her body beneath his palm, felt her fear as if it were his own. When the doctor finally straightened, his expression eased. "They're resting now. The fever's still high, but it's broken enough. With warmth, fluids, and rest, they'll pull through." Emily let out a sob, half relief and half exhaustion. She pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, then turned to the babies, her shoulders shaking. Caleb lowered himself beside her, his presence solid, unmovable. "Thank you," she whispered to the doctor, her voice breaking. Harrison packed away his bottles and cloths. "Thank him," he said, nodding toward Caleb. Only a fool would ride through a storm like this, but a man doesn't risk his life for nothing. He got me here in time." Emily turned, her tear-filled eyes meeting Caleb's. For a moment, neither spoke. The fire cracked, the wind roared, and the only sound between them was the faint breathing of the twins. Caleb cleared his throat, his voice low. "They'll be all right now." Emily nodded, though her tears fell faster. "I thought I was going to lose them." "You won't," Caleb said firmly. He reached for her hand, covering it with his large, calloused palm. "Not while I'm here." She swallowed hard, her lips trembling. Her gaze lingered on him, searching, as though trying to see past the gruffness of his words to the truth behind them. And she found it there, in his eyes, in the steadiness of his hand, in the raw exhaustion etched across his face. When the doctor finally took his leave, bundled in furs and heading back to town with Caleb's horse for company, silence fell heavy in the cabin. Caleb sank into the chair by the fire, his body bone-weary, every muscle aching from the ride and the cold. But his eyes never left Emily and the twins. Hours passed like that, the storm battering the house, the fire burning low. Emily tended the babies, sponging their foreheads, humming softly when they stirred. Caleb watched, half drifting in and out of sleep, until she finally turned to him. "You should rest," she said quietly. "I'll rest here," he answered, his voice rough. Close enough to hear them. She hesitated, then rose, crossing the room with hesitant steps. She knelt beside his chair, her hand finding his. "You could have died out there," she whispered. Caleb looked at her, at the tear tracks still glistening on her cheeks, at the fierce love in her eyes. His chest tightened, a weight he could no longer hold back pressing hard against his ribs. "I didn't care," he said. "All I thought about was getting back here. To you, to them." Her lips parted, her breath catching. The firelight flickered across her face, softening the hollows of exhaustion, illuminating the fragile hope stirring there. "Caleb." He leaned forward, his forehead nearly touching hers. "Before you came, I thought this place would stay empty forever, just me, the land, and silence. I'd made peace with it, or I thought I had. But then you showed up, and suddenly there's life here. Laughter. Even their crying," he nodded toward the cradle. "It makes the house feel alive again. I can't imagine going back to how it was before." Emily's eyes shone, tears gathering again, but this time they were different, lighter, warmer. She reached up, her fingers brushing the rough line of his jaw. "I was so afraid of what people would say, of the burden I'd bring. But I don't feel afraid when I'm here, with you." His breath shuddered out, and for a long moment, words failed him. Then, softly, he said, "Stay, Emily, not just as a guest. Stay and make this place your home. Ours, if you'll have me." Her tears spilled over as she smiled through them, small and trembling but real. "I'll stay, I want nothing more." Caleb pulled her into his arms, holding her as tightly as he dared. Her warmth pressed against him, her breath unsteady in his ear. For the first time in years, his heart beat not with loneliness but with hope. The storm raged on through the night, but inside the little cabin, a new peace had settled. When morning finally came, the blizzard had passed. The prairie lay buried in snow, glittering under a sky washed clean and bright. The air was sharp with cold, but the sun rose strong, promising the turn of seasons yet to come. The twins stirred, their fever broken, their cheeks flushed with returning health. Emily laughed softly as she rocked them, the sound like sunlight breaking through clouds. Caleb stood in the doorway, the snow crunching under his boots, watching her with a quiet awe that words could not contain. Days turned into weeks, and the ranch slowly returned to its rhythm. Caleb mended fences, split wood, tended cattle, but now there was always laughter drifting from the house, always the sound of Emily's voice calling from the porch, always the cries and coos of the twins filling the silence. By spring, the snow had melted, the prairie blooming with wildflowers and green shoots. The ranch was no longer a place of loneliness, but a home alive with love. One evening, Caleb and Emily stood together on the porch, the twins nestled in their arms. The sky was ablaze with sunset, the land stretching endlessly before them, full of promise. Emily leaned her head against his shoulder. "Do you ever think about how it might have been if we hadn't found you that night?" Caleb's arm tightened around her. "I try not to. All that matters is you did, and I'll thank God for it every day of my life." She smiled, her eyes soft with contentment. "So will I." As the twins gurgled and laughed, the prairie wind carried their voices far across the fields, blending with the sound of cattle lowing and birdsong in the distance. The house behind them glowed with the warmth of firelight, not empty now, but filled with life, with family, with love. Caleb Turner had once been a man resigned to solitude, his life marked by silence and loss. Now, with Emily at his side and the twins in his arms, he had found something greater than he ever dreamed. A new dawn had broken over the ranch, and with it, a home that would never again be lonely. And so, what was once a lonely rancher's silent world became a home filled with laughter, love, and the promise of tomorrow. Caleb Turner found not only the family he thought he had lost forever, but also a new beginning he never dreamed possible. Love had come to him in the most unexpected way, through a young widow, 2 tiny newborns, and the courage to open his heart once more. If you enjoyed this heartwarming tale of hope and second chances, be sure to subscribe to Wild West Love Chronicles so you never miss another story of love, resilience, and the untamed beauty of the frontier. Saddle up for more unforgettable romances coming your way.